Well, Mandy, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited this conversation, and just that sense of exploring something and understanding something just a little bit more than I don't already know. And I just don't know anything about your world, so I'm fascinated to have this discussion. But first of all, how are you?
I'm really good, actually. Thanks, Steve. No, it's a pleasure to be here. Apart from putting my back out a little at the weekend, no, I'm genuinely normally on great form.
Is that a gardening injury, or is that a carryover from fighter jet
Well,
wear and tear?
you know what? It was putting a mattress into the loft injury, which I'm not sure what that constitutes, but no, it was very frustrating. And yeah, I have had a bad back, actually, to be honest, ever since leaving the Air Force. And I had surgery 6 years ago where I had artificial disc replacement, and they did replace 2 discs on my spine. It was quite cutting edge surgery, and it has been so much better since then. But occasionally I do have these little lapses.
Okay, interesting. Is that a common thing, or is that something that
Yeah,
you've just taken its toll on you particularly?
I think a lot of, I mean, my husband's a pilot as well, and he also has a bad back in exactly the same place. And I think if you're very tall and a pilot, and you've been subjected to pulling G-force for many years, then I think, it is a common injury that a lot of us have.
Okay. Now, look, I've got a little glimpse into what it's like, has been like for you through your career from your book, brilliantly titled "An Officer, Not a Gentleman." But the only thing I could spot in there that I have some sort of similarity of experience was where you said that you were flying along Lake Bala in Snowdonia. Well, I've done that too, but it was on my bike and I had a serious tailwind. So that was the only thing I could go, yeah, I've done something similar. I'm not quite sure.
Did you wave people as you went past as well?
Yeah, I did. I was just. It was a screaming noise of me heading down that pass. But
fantastic.
Could you help me with this in terms of just giving me a bit of an overview of the sort of craft that you're dealing with? What sort of jets do you pilot, and what are the differences? Because I read through and I'm vaguely familiar with some of the terms. I recognise them, but could you just give us a bit of an overview there?
Yeah, so the training to become a fast jet pilot in the RAF takes you on just a building block approach, and you start by flying something that goes quite slowly. Myself, it was a Bulldog aircraft or a Firefly. It goes at about 120 miles an hour. As you progress at each stage of training, you go up to the next level. I've then flew the Tucano. It went at double the speed, so 250 miles an hour. And then you fly the Hawk, which is what the Red Arrows fly in. So that most people can imagine what that aircraft looks like. And that goes at double the speed again. So we're now up to sort of around about 500 miles an hour. And then when you fly your operational jet, which for myself was the Tornado GR4, which sadly is no longer in service. It went out of service a couple of years ago. That's going at a similarish speed. So I mean, the fastest speed it will go at is about Mach 1, on the paper, but you're normally flying it around about that sort of 400 to 600 miles an hour. It's not that much faster than the Hawk, but of course it's got a huge amount more capabilities than the Hawk would have been able to, because the Hawk's a training aircraft.
And is that capabilities in terms of turning, agility?
Not so much, bizarrely, not so much the turning and agility, because actually the Hawk, as an advanced flying trainer, is an incredibly agile aircraft. And it's like the mini Metro compared to a Formula One. So once you get into the Tornado, suddenly you've got the weapons that are hanging from it. You have, sort of decoys that go on the aircraft, things in the form of flares and chaff that we wear and put out. We have air-to-air missiles that we carry as well for air-to-air defense. So you've got lots of different aspects that you're carrying on that aircraft as well. And when we talk capability, we're talking about what is its potential to do.
Okay, fantastic. And what's the time course of being able to get to that top end? Is it something that people can take leaps and bounds towards, or is there a skill set and a physicality that takes simple time?
It takes simple time to do the training as well. And I mean, it took me about 5 years from joining the Air Force through to actually qualifying on the front line. That could be quicker, but at the moment there's things called holds within the system. So as you're going through, you'll finish one course, you're really excited about starting the next one, And unfortunately, there's a backlog of pilots. And so you end up going into this holding pool, which can often last up to about a year, maybe even 18 months. And that really stagnates you. So when you then are ready to start the next course, you almost have to go back and do what's called a refresher on that previous type, just so that your brain has sped up again to the level you need it to be to go on to the next stage of flying training.
Okay. And can you tell me what this? I'm interested immediately in terms of the physicality of it. You mentioned G forces and G suits and so on. Can you describe the physical demands upon you as a pilot? Because I think that's immediately something that people will connect with and understand, that at those high velocities, that's not for the faint-hearted, but you've also got to be physically strong and capable.
You do. And I think when I first joined the Air Force in 1994 and I left 10 years ago now, I don't think physicality was looked at in quite as much detail as it should have done. I think they started to realize that actually we need our pilots to be physically fit. They brought in training regimes as well, and fitness testing as well, which was across the board for every member of the armed forces to be doing, which was absolutely essential. And I know that now there are training programs for the pilots as well. They have to be at a certain level of fitness, because it's really, really important when you're fighting G-force in the air, and especially flying things like the newer aircraft like Typhoon and the F-35. There's a lot of G-force that you're sustaining there, and you wear a G suit, and basically what happens is that is connected into the aircraft, and it's a bladder system, and so it's a very tight fitting suit. It used to be just on your bottom half. Now it inflates on your arms and your upper half as well. And what it does is it compresses the blood vessels to prevent the blood from pooling. As you're pulling G-force and all your blood rushes to your feet, it tries to stop it from doing that. So it would rush away from your brain and your eyes, and where it's important for it to be, into your extremities. And so if you can inflate these bladders around the surface of the skin very, very tightly, it compresses them and it will keep your blood pressure high to where it matters the most.
And so I'm imagining something a little bit like your blood pressure cuff, but all over.
Yes.
With a simple job of ensuring the blood does not leave the head.
Yes.
Is it as unpleasant as having that blood pressure cuff, but all over?
Yeah, I remember the first time I ever used one, and you've been trialed for them and you've been fitted to them, and they're all tightly snug. They look like a pair of like cowboy chaps. Well, the first ones that I was wearing, and I remember thinking, I am so cool. And we got out to this aircraft, we plugged it in, and we started to fly, and it kicks in at 2G. Now at 2G, it's not too much. It's like being on a little roller coaster ride sort of thing, where your cheeks get a bit heavy, and this thing inflated and it hit me in the stomach. And I remember thinking, oh my God. And basically what happens is it's actually really in twofold. So the first thing is it's inflating. You automatically tense your stomach to brace for the impact of it. And in doing so, you're also stopping the blood from pooling. That simple act of almost there sort of straining against it also helps. So it gives you about 2 to 3 more times force of gravity in protection against the G-force.
Okay, so if we go back some period in time, I presume these G suits weren't around. So you were down to your basic Valsalva maneuver and individual tolerance, were you?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I flew to Carnos, which was the training aircraft before the Hawk, they didn't have a G suit on there. And it was fascinating because we were pulling sustained 4G turns, doing what's called maximum rate turns. And when I was flying it, because I'm very tall as well, I mean, there were a lot of other male pilots that were equally as tall as me, if not taller. And we often said, gosh, actually you have to really fight to keep the blood pressure up. And you do an anti-G straining maneuver, which is very amusing to watch. If you've ever seen anyone do the centrifugal, test where they are sort of, you basically take a deep breath, force against it, push the blood pressure back up into your brain, and then a very quick intake of breath to replace and replenish that blood supply. And that, if you're doing it for a sustained period of time, can be quite challenging. And occasionally I did used to get what's called grey out, where you see your vision starts to tunnel in, and you're left with these 2 very, very small tunnels that you're looking down. And if you cannot get the oxygen up to your brain or release the G-force at that point, you will start to lose sight. And it's called graying out. And that is the first stage of before you would then go into G-lock, which is the loss of consciousness brought on by G-force.
Okay, so shutting down kind of blood flow to the eyes and the brain in that sense. That starts me off on a line of thought about the sort of interaction between the physical and the mental capabilities and the skill set of it. As you're starting to feel that pull in, are you then also feeling a deterioration in your abilities? You've got the physical going, but in terms of your ability to scan or spot or undertake a precision maneuver, how's that maintained?
Yeah, and I mean, basically, it's done so that you hopefully don't get to this position. So you're taught anti-G straining maneuvers. We're given preventative equipment with the G suit as well. And if you start to see that your vision is going down, then you need to release the G-force. The problem comes, of course, when actually there's been problems with G suits inflating. And so John Egging, one of the Red Arrows pilots that so sadly lost his life at Bournemouth, was down to his G suit not inflating, and he had induced loss of consciousness because of G-force. And we do see it. So if you're doing a snap maneuver, we would say, for example, in an emergency brake, so you're coming towards, for example, a mid-air collision or the ground, and you pulled, very substantial amount of G-force, you might temporarily lose consciousness. And it's how quickly can you come back from that? So it's something that you obviously don't want to get yourself into that position for. And we're taught and given techniques to prevent that from happening.
Okay, so is that simply steadying the plane, for example? So pulling out of the maneuver so that you have a release of the G-force. And is that something that's... I'm leaping ahead now because this is so fascinating, but how's that managed in dogfights, for example, whereby you might not just go, I'll just do a bit of nice steady flying for a little bit because I need to. How's that managed?
I mean, the dogfighting scenario, which for those that don't know is air-to-air combat, so it's basically quite gladiatorial in its nature. You're one pilot or a crew pitting their wits against another one, and it's your classic Top Gun that you're seeing. That is very physical. I mean, we would be in training going to do 2, possibly 3 trips a day, and you would be physically exhausted. I mean, you feel like you've been beaten up, not just by the G suit, but by constant pulling of G-force, and then the planning and the thinking, and the mental acuity that is needed for that. They were exhausting periods of flying training, and advanced flying training is really intense at the best of times, but that air combat phase was particularly tough.
And how do you train for that? In terms of the physical training, do you do specific out of plane training? We I'm not sure that's a term. Sorry, Mandy. Non-pool training would be the equivalent for swimmers. That sort of thing.
It's just about maintaining a good physical fitness. And again, it was not something that was really focused on, bizarrely, when we were going through flying training. They said, stay fit. But it wasn't looked at like it is now. It's a very different scenario now, whereby people really are, at the peak of their physical fitness, and they have to be, because, it's like in everything, isn't it? If you think back to sport, 20 years ago, it's not that we didn't have that same level of what is high performance sport, what does it need, let's talk mindset, diet, everything that goes with it. Now we wouldn't have that huge team around us, and I think that's the same for flying. It has advanced enormously.
And so that gets me thinking about the prerequisites and whether they're evolving in itself. Are there a few non-negotiables still that makes a good fighter pilot? It sounds as though, so in the parallel with sport, for example, what we have seen is an evolution of the kind of almost the genetics that are required to win. And whereas before, it was just off the scale gene freaks in the nicest possible way that would succeed, and a good training program. And now you can probably lower the level of genetic requirement, but through systematic support and individualization. You need this, you need that. You can get them there. You can get them to that kind of winning level. Are there a few requisites that are still essential?
Do you not think on that, Steve, though, the mindset of the individual is still paramount? So yes, you can perhaps lower that bar, but I mean, I know that when I've listened to or I've spoken to high performance athletes, it's when you hear about that dogged determination, they are single-minded in their pursuit of their goals. And I think really when you look at pilots, that's probably a similar thing as well. They have decided very early on in their careers that they want to do this job, and they will go to, you know, the nth degree to achieve that. And, you know, when you say what are the basic requirements, I mean, I can see it actually with youngsters. When I was a volunteer and I used to fly air cadets, you know, they're coming in at 13 to 18-year-olds, and you're taking them up in an air experience flight, 30 minutes in a small propeller aeroplane. You could spot the people that would make good pilots almost on their first trip, because they have this thing called situational awareness, whereby they sense where they are in the bigger picture. And it's something inherent in you. One of my sons has it, my other son doesn't. It's fascinating. And it's not linked in any way to intelligence. It really is not. It's just this inherent, we would say someone has a good set of hands. They feel there's a natural, you know, identity, and that they can almost, they feel at one with the aircraft. And it's fascinating. I've only met very few natural pilots in my life, because you can do a lot of training to enable yourself to be at a higher standard. But the ones that I have met, you think, wow, you will be a brilliant pilot.
So you mentioned bigger picture, and I read that in the book. I'm trying to connect with the section that you wrote about it. I think it was where you were talking about teamworks and your confidence was slipping. Oh, yeah. You had this weight of expectation. There was a sense of you weren't sleeping very well.
Yeah.
You weren't eating very well, which I can't imagine is that handy for handling one of those. But there was a sense of getting your mojo back. And you mentioned bigger picture in there around. So can you unpack that a little bit? That sense of, okay, you're entering some sort of flow state of some sort, but there was this idea of spatial connection with your environment.
It's really, really important. So situational awareness when you're flying is absolutely the key. It's seeing where are you within not just the aircraft, but in, you know, time and space. But it's also a projection of what will be happening in the immediate future. So we use this thing called NUTA: notice it, understand, and think ahead. So when we are feeling a cognitive overload, one of the first of our senses that tends to go is always our hearing. And you will see that all the time, I'm sure, in high performance sports, you know, whereby when someone's getting maxed out, they're not hearing what's going on. And as an instructor, you see that happening too. You'll see people missing radio calls and you think, oh, they're at cognitive overload. But if we're not noticing things, then you can't understand the implications of them, and you certainly can't project ahead. So this NUTA: notice, understand, and think ahead. And it's actually a really, really handy technique, because if you can utilize periods of lower workload when you're not, you know, in a demanding low level flying environment, when you're not about to do a target run to hit a target within 5 seconds, you've utilized the planning time, for example, the time when you're on the ground, when you are in that moment where you think about every what if scenario, you consider all the threats, any potential errors that you could make. You try to get so ahead of the game so that when you're now in this period of high workload, you're going back to your basics of everything that you've already planned for. So when the crisis happens or the emergency happens or something unusual happens, you've already thought about it. That's really, really powerful. And that's really powerful for anybody in any walk of life at all. So, you know, as they say, you know, plan to fail, fail to plan, and all those good things, those great analogies. But for myself in that situation, I was losing the bigger picture. We were doing tactical low flying. We were going out as a pair of aircraft. It was the very final stages of my fast jet training. And we were hitting targets in the field. We would say it was in Wales within 5 seconds. Now, at the time, technology was not as advanced as it is. We had no moving map, no head-up display. We literally had a paper map, a stopwatch, and a compass. You're with a wingman. You're trying to stick 3/4 of a mile apart at all times. There's an enemy, your instructor. They're trying to get behind you to simulate shooting you down with a missile. And so you're trying to evade that threat whilst hitting targets and managing everything. Now, this is a scenario where they are trying to overload you. Once you get to the front line and you're then flying your operational jet, like the Tornado or the Harrier for ourselves, well, then you've got tools on that aircraft that will help you. Now, at this point, they're trying to, let's not say break you, but they want to get you to maximum capacity because they say, have you got the ability to cope under pressure? Now, I was basically getting up to these turns, they're called battle turns, and you both have to plan ahead and you have to basically help your wingman out. So as you're coming up to a turn, you can't just both turn left because now you're in a stream behind each other. So as I'm coming up to a turn, I'm thinking, right, how many degrees do I need to assist? We both need to pull up. We both need to cross at a perpendicular angle. So you're doing a lot of mental gymnastics, working out exact dimensions. And I would always roll out in the wrong place. And then I'm now vulnerable, because I'm not in a perfect situation to check the 6 o'clock of my wingman, who's basically vulnerable to attack from the enemy. And this is what I was failing. And now everything was snowballing. And I was going back to my room every night and I would sit on my bed and we would have full mental dress rehearsal. So I had a cardboard cockpit, I would flick switches, I would make radio calls. I would run through every single bit of the flight that I could possibly think of to practice. My stress bucket was completely overloaded. As you touched on, I wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating. I had skin rashes, and I wasn't talking to anybody because I did not want to expose myself as being weak or vulnerable or not coping. But I certainly wasn't. And it was my course mates that spotted it. And they took me down and we got out into this big parade square and we started cycling around, pretending to be in battle formation. So pretending to be aeroplanes, but on our bikes. And by doing this, they kept saying, Mans, look at the bigger picture. Look at the bigger picture. And I was going, but how many degrees are we? And they say, don't look at that. Where are we? And suddenly it was like, oh my gosh, this is so easy. And it's that whole situation, isn't it? Where I think, Steve, we get so fixated on what we are doing. You keep on doing it in the same way. I mean, it's so like high performance sport. You need somebody different to say, why stop fixating on the numbers, start to enjoy it again. And you go, oh, and suddenly you see performance improve for somebody. And they go, gosh, you wouldn't have thought that would work. And actually for myself, I flew the next day. It went really well. I passed the flight. I gained my RAF wings. So it considered a good thing at this point after 4 years of training. And really it was my wingmen, my course mates that got me through by looking at it in a very different perspective.
Oh, that is just fascinating. So very specifically there, I was getting your head up and not look. So just look at the bike, which I can relate to, is not just thinking about where the wheel is, but where you are in the environment. And I suppose that then means that some of the controls are just taking care of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think up to that point, I'd been trying to do it by the numbers. For example, I'm heading along on a heading of 090 and I need to be turning through 63 degrees to and I was adding all these. And actually, if you just looked at it and you saw it and you watched two jets pull up and you can see you cross at a perpendicular angle and you can look at them where they're turning out and then you can turn in and you're going, oh my gosh, I'm not even looking at the numbers. My head is out the cockpit. Now, surely that's a better thing. I mean, there's a technique as well where people used to say, oh, you're over map reading. And it sounds madness. So you're doing navigation skills. You're learning these new skills. You've got this map. You've planned this map in intricate detail with degrees. Where is the wind from? What will be my heading correction to take into account of wind? What's my next turning point? And you've got all this planned on a map. And then you get airborne and you are so fixated on this map that you stop looking outside as much and you keep on thinking, oh, must look at my map. And my instructor was this very experienced guy called The Shoe, Dick Schuster, and he was as old and bold as they came. And I was about to go off on my final thing. He said, Mandy, I noticed in your notes you've been over map reading. And I said, oh, I do have a tendency. He said, just give me your map, will you? And it was literally minutes before we got airborne. And I spent hours planning this map. It was beautiful. It was a work of art, quite frankly. And he took it and he basically used this huge marker and he had this white piece of paper and he just wrote down a heading. And then what my turning point was, church, heading, wood. And then he gave me this piece of paper back. He kept the map. And I'm now going, I can't do it with this. He said, it'll stop you over map reading. I was like, we got over. And of course, there was nothing to look at. So I'm now looking out the window again. I was like, so again, forcing you to see a bigger picture.
Fantastic. A bit like taking the blinkers off for a horse in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. The mighty shoe, he knew well.
The mighty shoe. What a nickname. Okay, there's a couple of other little concepts in there that I'd love to pick up on. NUTA is just the best acronym ever in the world, because it probably just alludes to maybe what you've got to have a little bit of a screw loose to. Yeah. But it also, so notice, understand, think ahead. You can't be doing those as a process of, okay, I'll need to notice now. Okay, here I go. I'm going to make sure I understand this. It almost speaks to a sense of mastery and automaticity of the skills that you're required to do the movements. And I guess for everyday folk, that would be learning to drive, where it feels like, right, think about the pedal, think about the indicators, and then suddenly it becomes automatic, and then you can notice things. Yeah. Is there a certain level where that acronym becomes particularly pertinent for you to be feeling the sensory inputs without even thinking about it?
Yes and no. So it's used across the whole of aviation now, actually. So British Airways use it, NUTA. So when something happens, for example, a light bulb could go on and they go, oh, never mind, it's something insignificant. But actually, because they've noticed it and they go, hold on a minute, we're going on a 3-day flight down to South Africa. Will we have the engineering support down there? So they've noticed it, they're understanding the implications of it, and they're projecting ahead to say, actually, yes, it's going to cause an inconvenience to our passengers at this moment, but if we turn back, get this sorted, it won't have a knock-on effect in consequences down the route. So there's little things like that. So we try to do it all the time, this NUTA. Put it into a driving scenario. It's like listening to the radio and hearing that there's an incident on the motorway up ahead. Now, if you hadn't been hearing that, you're driving along in your own little world and you're listening to music and you're happy, and see all the brake lights going on, and it's an emergency. It's a slam my brakes on. But if you'd noticed it because you'd heard the radio, you've understood the implications of where it's happening. So as soon as a brake light goes on, you're prepared, you're ready, because you're seeing the bigger picture. So it's always about trying to force people to get out of their little world they're in and actually expand their knowledge to the bigger picture.
Fascinating. Okay, that's interesting from a procedural point of view. And you mentioned that you're, and I know you're facilitating team developments too, in terms of what if scenarios, debriefing, managing threats and preparing. That sounds like a very transferable process that a lot of people could apply.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the debrief thing is just, it's amazing how many businesses or organizations I talk to, and I say, and obviously something that we do in aviation is we debrief after every single flight, training, operational, we sit, and it's just part of the process, and when we sort of, it's almost like a golfer hitting a ball off into the dark and getting no feedback as to where it's gone. You wouldn't do it, would you? You need feedback to improve performance. And so you say to businesses, do you debrief? And they go, oh yes, we call it a post-mortem. And you go, no, it shouldn't be a negative. It shouldn't always just be, wrapped around that thought of something's gone badly and therefore we need to debrief it. It's almost like, oh, there was something that was really well handled within our corporation or within our business. Let's debrief that and learn and share the best practice to the rest of the team. But we always I use this debrief funnel. It's like, what happened? What were the facts? Which is non-negotiable, because that's not up for debate, because they are facts. Why did it happen? What's the cause? But you're trying to elicit 3 or 4 key elements to be how can we be better? What's the cure? And if you've taken those 3 or 4 key elements from those fact line, from the timeline, for example, and you break them down through really good facilitated questioning, why, how, when, who, with no blame involved at all, because you remove emotion from it. And as soon as you feel yourself going, what, who did that? Then you take yourself back, because it's not about who did something, it's about why. And so you get to this root cause, and then you can actually learn from it. And it's just so powerful, and it's part of pilots' every single day routine. never have I done a flight without debriefing it.
I've got to observe that it's perhaps the most common anomaly of talking to businesses and transferring high performance concepts, that when you mention debrief, it tends to be, we had a quick chat after that really important pitch meeting on the way to the airport. No, that didn't sound like a debrief to me. And then it appears as though you're making the same mistakes.
Yeah.
And yeah, that does seem like, but maybe we're just hardwired to jump from one thing to the next, perhaps, rather than thinking methodically about what gain can we create time after time. But we stole that from talking to you guys in the military.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, why would you not debrief? People always say, oh, it's because we don't have time. It's like, this is crazy. By not creating the time, you're never learning, and therefore you're just in this downward spiral. So you see the businesses that are doing the best, the ones that make the time, even if it's something a really quick one, what went well, what went badly, what do we need to do more of? Really quickly. There was this other thing that we started to do as well, latterly in my career, and it was feedback with a boost. And I loved it. It was sort of, you grab someone, and it's not in the formal debriefing, but I would say, oh, Steve, can I just grab you for a quick boost? What I've got to say is balanced, observed, objective, specific, and timely. And it's really positive, because just by the sheer word boost, you think, oh, they're going to help me. And it's that whole feedback is a gift. It's not a gift. People hate it. As soon as you say, can I give you some feedback? People go, oh no, it's going to be awful. Your heart falls and drops. But if you say, can I just give you a quick boost? There's just a couple of points I think would mean basically take you to the next level of performance. That seems really positive. And so we started to do that more and more as well. And that worked really well.
I love that. That's great reframing. Can I pick up another? So I'm still on your previous discussion about, I just want to pick up on this idea of overload. We again have picked up this phrase in high performance sport about hard training, easy combat, or easy training, hard combat. But specifically, that's a life or death situation. You do that to protect yourself. It sounded as though there was almost a bit of a mountain to climb, where you had to overcome that overload in order to pass the various tests you were put in front of. But ultimately, that was preparing you for combat, which is, like you say, you've got the full game plan in place there. In terms of preparing you for that overload period, what's the process of going through that? Because handling that pressure is critical in terms of developing that skill set.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's why they make advanced flying training so difficult. I mean, we did lose quite a few people from the courses, at each of the stages as well. So when I got to fly the Tornado, I almost thought, oh, it's quite easy in comparison, because I've got someone now sitting in the back seat, because we had a navigator and they became then known as a weapons systems operator. So you're part of a team now. And actually, that's not an instructor in the back that's trying to catch you out to overload you. They are there to assist, for you to work well as a team together. And that was quite exciting. And then we also had a head-up display, which suddenly I've got a lot of green writing, which is telling me all the information I need in front of me. I'm not looking down at a load of instruments. I've also now got a moving map, which is telling me where I am in the world. So I'm not having to know and keep this huge amounts of situational awareness going. So when you got to fly the Tornado or your frontline jet, it was much easier in many ways than advanced flying training. But of course, now you're going to take that jet. You've learned how to fly it, then you learn how to fight it. And that's when we would go on exercises, for example, to America. We did a huge exercise called Red Flag, which is in the Arizona desert. And it was replicating the theatre of war that we were in at the time in Iraq. And, the philosophy out there is you're going to train harder than you will ever have to fight for real. And that's exactly it. So again, giving you more and more complex scenarios so that you're working as a team, working through all the issues, the problems, the planning stages to come together with this amazing plan. And then you get airborne, and they would even throw extra scenarios of things happening. For example, they'd simulate someone had been shot down and you were suddenly having to retask to become an on-scene commander to take control with a downed air crew. And again, they were just giving you scenarios that when you then were flying in Iraq, in the different operations and we were operating in, you've already practiced stuff that's probably harder than that. So although you've now got the adrenaline of being in a war zone with people actually on the ground trying to shoot at you to kill you, you're still in your environment that you have practiced and practiced and practiced. So what can be automatic is automatic. And that's that whole, when I suppose that goes back to your point there of when does NUTA become an autonomous process? It's in that phase where really we've tried to get the flying as becoming as automatic as we can so that our brain has the capacity to deal with complex issues outside of that.
Fantastic. And what is the difference then between that overloaded training, training harder than you'll ever have to experience in combat, but then what is it like in combat? How do you then, I guess, reconcile that I've got skills, I've got competency, but now this is real?
Yeah, it's interesting really, because the first time I found myself in a war zone, which was Operation Telic at the time, which was flying over Iraq from Ali Al Salem in Kuwait. My first ever mission, I walked in and most people we were doing a lot of reconnaissance at the time. You were taking photos, and then I walked into the briefing room. They said, okay, today's mission is a bombing mission. I was like, gosh, I wasn't expecting that, which sounds crazy, but we weren't doing much of that at the time. We were mainly doing reconnaissance trips. And so again, there's one fantastic thing that you have, which is you're put to often fly with someone who's a very senior navigator. So they would try to twin up a junior pilot or a junior navigator with a seriously experienced navigator or pilot the other way around. And so you'd often find the boss, for example, if he was a navigator, would fly with the junior pilot. So you have a really great mix, and it means that you've almost got a mentor sitting on your shoulder, which is really powerful on your experience and your learning. So they're constantly guiding you to enable you as a team to make better quality decisions. So you're not alone in the aircraft. You're also in a formation, and you're going to be briefing. You're planning it together, you're briefing it together, you're going through all the what if scenarios together. What happens if you lose an engine here, Mandy? What happens there? What happens if the navigation kit's not spot on? So you're, again, thinking outside of the norm so that if that did happen, you've already got a plan in your mind. So that gives you that capacity as well.
I love that. And I'm just, again, drawing parallels back to my world of sport in terms of supporting a junior athlete. If you've got a senior coach who's able to say, it's going to be okay, it's going to be fine, don't worry, trust me, that calms. But when an athlete becomes a medalist, senior, they become almost the guide. They become sort of solely responsible, and the coach is there almost as just another pair of ears just to bounce the ideas off, as opposed to instructional early in career. Perhaps that turns into much more of empowering. You're in charge now. Yeah.
And actually something that the military do really, really well, certainly in the Air Force, and what I saw anyway, was you would be on a mission, and even if you're at a relatively early stage of your career, you were tasked to lead that formation. And it could be on a relatively easy, say, an average mission over the border. If that mission then became way more complex, for example, you were shot at by a surface-to-air missile or something went wrong, the senior people in your formation don't leap in and take control. You are number one, somebody else is number 2, 3, and 4. You don't suddenly all change positions and say, oh, number 4, you've got way more experience, you take over the lead. You don't do that. So even if you're the most junior person, you will continue to lead, even though the complexity is now through the roof. And in doing so, you get a much more empowered workforce, because you're also ensuring that people are accountable in their own decisions from an early stage of their career, that they're pushing themselves to their own capability limits, that you're giving them the tools because they've got that support network of a crew who are working really well together to enable high level quality decisions to be made. And also we introduce concepts like a decision-making model, which is called DODA, again, used across the airline world, where we diagnose a problem. We share that with the team, and we don't, as the leader, say, this is what I think the problem is. You say, what do you see the problem is? And your team come back and tell you. So the diagnosis is there's no contamination of your own ideas. You then ask the team for options. What would you do? That's not showing weakness or vulnerability. That is showing incredible leadership, because you want to get the input from your team. But once you have the input on that option stage, the options have been generated, you as the leader compile all of that information, you make the decision. So it's not a collaborative decision-making process, it's option generation that's leading to the leader making the decision. You then assign the tasks and you review it, or I like to say for the R is, give me a reason not to, almost question, I think Richard Branson has it. He has these no men because he says yes to everything. He says, give me a reason not to do this. And then normally go, well, there's lots of reasons, actually, we shouldn't. So actually, rather than just getting sucked into that whole sunk cost fallacy of I've invested time and effort making this decision, now I'm just going to go through it because I have made that decision. Give me a reason not to. And actually, by doing that, it's a really empowering decision-making model to involve everybody in it, but with the accountability still sitting in the leadership structure.
But going through that process, as you say, you're not showing weakness as a leader. You're specifically empowering the workforce, aren't you? It's not a case of command and control in the sense of that I'm the font of all knowledge. I'll bear all the brunt of responsibility by making a decision based on my thoughts. Let's create this together. And as you mentioned, kind of going into that combat situation, there's the preparation, there's the over skilling up and developing your skills. But you also mentioned we're in this together. we're I guess when things get hot, you're at least going to be able to say, I've got the backing of my buddies here.
Yeah, and all of their experience. And, I certainly had that many times when I was over Iraq, where something would happen. And I think, my goodness, I mean, there was, of course, a level of imposter syndrome. I think most people do have that to some degree. And I know it's something we talk about a lot at the moment with regards to mental health as well. And, and I did have imposter syndrome. I used to think, oh my goodness, I can't believe, Mandy from Manchester is up here making decisions. But ultimately, you've got the backing of your wingmen. It's a really powerful tool. They're on your side.
Now, I haven't mentioned anything to do with the fact that you're a woman. I don't know whether I should raise it. Do you know what I mean?
I wonder if anyone noticed.
Yeah, I think I should probably. The at least the excuse is the name of your book. So, An Officer, Not a Gentleman, very specifically pointing out I'm not one of those. And I suppose we've just had this conversation that's irrespective of your gender. But should we talk about that? Is that important? It's from a historical, from a physical, from a role modelling point of view.
Yes and no. So really refreshing that we haven't talked about it, because I think so often, I'll be honest, I do a few odd podcasts here and there. It's one of the things that it's like, you're a woman in a man's world. I was also a fast jet pilot, and all we have been talking about is being a fast jet pilot, which is brilliant. And, it is nice to be there as a role model. I'll be honest. I often get asked about, let's say, legacy. Is legacy important? And I think not my own personal legacy, but legacy that actually we have enabled, ourselves, for those first few of us that were female fast jet pilots. So Jo Salter was the first for the Tornado. I came through as about the second. We had Mitch Tompkins, who was the first female Harrier pilot. We had Kirsty Murphy, who was the first female Red Arrows pilot. We're a generation of sort of first, seconds, thirds. And I think we're just creating role models for our younger generation, because there's a lovely quote from one of the first female astronauts who said, you can't be what you can't see. And it's true. You need people to sort of go, actually, there are women doing it. Why shouldn't I? And it's less of an issue, I think, for our youngsters that are coming through now. Well, I thought it was until I wrote my book. And I had not really been massively up on social media hugely. It wasn't an important part for me before the book, actually, but I thought I'd better just get out there on Instagram and a bit more on Twitter. I received daily comments from youngsters saying, I love your book. This has given me it's made me remember why I wanted to do this. It's made me realize I can do this. You know, and you think, fantastic, great, because we do need people that we can look up to and aspire to be like. And yeah, and I find it really refreshing, actually, Steve, that you haven't sort of talked about it, because it wasn't a massive issue for me. And I know that sounds crazy when you look back and think, but you were the only woman on any course you went through, and you were the only woman on the squadron. Why wasn't it an issue? I think I became fairly thick-skinned about it. I had an incredible band of brothers that I went through flying training with. They were my best friends. You know, the fact I was a woman, it wasn't an issue. I was loud. I was, you know, huge extrovert. I'm 6 foot tall. I'm never going to be the grey person. You know, I did stand out, but I stood out for being Mandy, not just for being a woman. And I think, you know, I'm proud of who I am and what I achieved as well. There were times when it was difficult. I cannot lie. You know, there were times when I questioned, had I made the right decision, which was a real shame. And it was often down to individuals that I just think were in a bad place themselves, as so often is the case. But overall, I had an incredible career in the Air Force, and you know, I would recommend it to anybody. And if my legacy has been that it's encouraged more women to go into it, well, then yeah, I'm very proud of that legacy.
Yeah, and I think that's part of my motivation is to acknowledge that, should we even recognize it, but I was motivated by a number of female leaders that I've encouraged or supported, who have said things like, I've never had somebody to look up to, and introducing them to somebody that they can means, I can now see a role model that I want to be like, that's like me. And specifically after I spoke to Tess Morris Patterson, who's training to be an astronaut, for the podcast, we had so much response in the same way of, well, it's not necessarily I want to be an astronaut, but I'd like to be something. I'd like to do something. And it wasn't just from girls. It wasn't just from women. It was from guys too, who turned around and said, actually, that sense of, why not me? Why can't I do this? If I have to go the extra mile, if I have to prove people wrong, then I've got now somebody that I can look to say, that's somebody that's done that.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. And it's fascinating because my mum always said, if it's going to be someone, why shouldn't it be you? And I thought, and it sort of sounds like it's like a double negative almost, but it really rang true to me of, well, actually, why shouldn't it be me? I'm, you know, I've done well at school. I've worked hard. I've held leadership positions throughout the whole of my university. You know, I was in a good position to go in, and I'd aspired to do this. And it was a dream that I was really passionate about. I mean, the big stumbling point for myself was when I failed all of the aptitude tests to be a pilot. And that did come as a huge blow, but again, not to be deterred. And that has acted as a really wonderful, again, role modeling of behavior around determination for many young people. And again, not just girls at all. Loads of young guys are contacting me going, oh my gosh, thank you, Mandy. You know, you've made me realize that I can achieve my goals still. I mean, an example would be my husband as well, severely dyslexic, left school. In fact, we were talking about it this morning. He said, my last report said, never come back, never show your face at this school again. It was to an incredibly elite private school at the time, you know, and he was bullied, severely dyslexic, and left with nothing. And he ended up as now one of the most qualified airline pilots. You know, he has every training qualification, every certificate, he's got it, you know. And he has been a very, very talented aviator for the whole of his career. But, you know, because he was so dyslexic, he believed he was thick. He believed that he was stupid. And he has taken years and years to overcome that and to find a way around it and to believe that he is good enough. And not just good enough, actually, he sees things differently. So again, it's not about putting people in parcels and packages and saying you don't fit into this mold. You know, we need that cognitive diversity that comes from people thinking differently.
Great story. I feel like I got to know Craig through the book. It's it was that dynamic and that that the ups and downs, but also that personal reflections, the honesty. You also say bugger 18 times. I looked up how many times. I got the pic
because I was trying not to be too rude, and I thought bugger was the one thing that was a little bit rude, but not too rude.
It has that personal sense, which is great. Every now and again, it's just bugger. What I know you're working in facilitating groups. Have you done any work in sport? And I think there's so much that people could learn from your experiences.
Yeah, I'm just getting into it, actually. Bizarrely, I spoke to Bath Rugby Club just before their European semi-final the other night. So I did a session with them, and and I'd love to do some more work in sport. It was interesting, actually, because I climbed up Kilimanjaro about 18 months ago now, and we went to the Elite Athlete Centre in Loughborough, and we used the altitude rooms. It was their first time they'd been used, and they used us as a package, and it was fantastic. And when I was there, I thought, I was chatting to quite a few different athletes that were around as well, and I just thought, the parallels are enormous. It's an area I would certainly love to get more into, actually.
And but on that aspect, I know you're working and facilitating sort of businesses as such, but what is it you're I suppose I'm trying to find the right question in terms of, is there a nugget that you're finding? We've mentioned debrief. Is there a nugget that you're finding that's really sticking and really translatable?
Yeah, I think the area of culture, really, when you look at what aviation have done with regards to culture in the last, let's say, 25 years or something, it is phenomenal. We went, and I use aviation as an industry here. We're not talking RAF, we're talking the whole of aviation. We went from a blame culture whereby we never ever learn from mistakes to having a really open and honest reporting culture. And it was done in a few different ways, actually. One was from recognizing that aeroplanes were crashing with an alarming regularity, and it was always down to human error. Well, 75% of the time it was down to human error, and yet we weren't learning from the mistakes. And so they realized that for every, it's this pyramid basically, for every one incident that you have, which for us is often a crash with huge loss of life, there will be 30 minor incidents which had to be reported on. But beneath your waterline, that classic iceberg, you have 300 near misses. Now, 300 times when exactly the same set of circumstances happened, but they got away with it. And if you have a blame culture, you never learn what the 300 are, because they're always just capped. And people go, got away with that, don't need to tell anyone. They realized this was the issue. And so they realized they didn't want to just constantly be proactive, always reacting to this one and working down. They wanted to find out what were their 300. And so I set about this program called What's Your 300 Events? And I was working with the police. And we started the session by saying, who has made a mistake? Silence. 300 policemen and women, all silent. And then we started to talk about cultural change and really, and how exciting it is to learn from our mistakes. I said, who's had a brilliant 300 event they want to share? Oh, the arms were shooting up, because suddenly they were thinking of it as a great opportunity to share an incident, not I'd made a mistake. This is such a simple twist again to the way our brains are working, that we're now part of the solution, not the problem. If we make a mistake, we feel like it's a problem. If we are creating data and knowledge to enable us to make better quality decisions, to enable things not to happen in the future, then we're feeling we're solution-based. And it's so we want to be part of that. And so they've set about this thing called the just culture. And it's a statement where they say, a just culture recognizes that competent professionals will make mistakes. It also recognizes that those very same professionals will develop unhealthy norms in the form of shortcuts, routine rule violations, but there is zero tolerance for recklessness. So there's a line in the sand. If you are reckless or there is sabotage, there will be punitive action. But anything to the left of that, I don't care what it is, we want to know about it. If you found yourself deviating from a procedure, if you found yourself taking a shortcut, if you made an error, just tell us about it, because we want to learn. And the reports started flooding in. And it changed the mindset. Now, if businesses, if organizations, if sports groups can do this, and you take away that blame completely of someone has done something on the sports pitch, and rather than the eye roll of, oh, he missed or she missed, or, rather than that, the person knows they've messed up. They know they made an error. But it's almost like that, straight back into, right, come on then, guys. That's happened. Let's move on. Almost let's take that and be excited about it to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Rather than going back to the changing room and saying, well, that was rubbish. That, it's not about that, is it? It's constantly about getting the right mindset. And I think we've worked so hard on that in aviation. In 2017, we did not have one loss of life through an aviation accident. That is phenomenal, because you looked at how many aircraft were flying. I think it was one incident in 17.8 million departures. Now, that is unheard of as a safety record. People are dying more regularly on roads and things. So how did they do that? And it's about looking at cultural change. And so that has been one of the most powerful nuggets, I think, that when businesses come to me and we say, let's really get down to, do you have a blame culture? But no. Well, until you start unpicking it, and then the individual starts saying, well, actually, I never really tell people if I mess up, So it's fascinating.
I love the fact you picked that out. It's one of the things that you can spot so quickly. It's one of the things that corrodes teams so aggressively, but is so often entrenched. I think raising, I raise it in my talk specifically around blame. As soon as you get the finger pointing after a games, it wasn't my fault. That's another version of blame, which is not just the finger pointing, it was your fault. It wasn't my fault. It was everyone else's fault. And it is such a simple action that when people recognize that is taking teams down, then that's the first base. I think, as you allude to, there are a lot of tentacles, a lot of training, a lot of communication development that underpin that. But I love that. I love that lesson. That's incredible. Mandy, what a joy to talk to you. It's been fascinating, absolutely incredible. The insights that you've brought, the frameworks I loved, the NUTAs and the DODAs, and was there anyone else? There's a couple in there.
I just love my acronyms.
No, NUTAs and DODAs is enough for anyone for it. But congratulations, everything you've achieved. Thank you for being that role model and communicating what you've learned. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Steve. Honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure we could talk for hours.
For sure.
Thank you.